Have you ever seen a noble hunting dog carry a thoroughbred foal across a flooded river in Yorkshire? I'm not exaggerating. This is a true story, and it happened right here at Ashford Manor. I am Sir William Ashford. These days, I'm known as the somewhat eccentric lord who manages the Ashford Wildlife Sanctuary. But I wasn't always the gentle soul you might picture wandering through rain-soaked English fields with a thermos of Earl Grey in hand. I'm a former British Army officer, a survivor of Afghanistan's dust and thunder, and, for better or worse, a man molded by duty, loss, and the weight of family legacy. This, all of it, is why the story I'm about to share means more to me than you can imagine. Let me set the scene for you. It's late autumn. The Yorkshire sky is dark with rain clouds that refuse to move, and the estate itself feels almost swallowed by mist and mud. On days like this, the air tastes of old stone, river water, and memories you can't quite shake. There's a stillness before a storm, the kind soldiers feel deep in their bones. I knew something was coming, I just didn't know what. And then there's Rufus. Rufus isn't just a dog, he's my oldest companion, a graying Labrador with a soldier's patience and a poet's heart. In Afghanistan, he saved me more than once, not by sniffing out explosives or barking at insurgents, but by simply being there in the long, haunted nights when the past refused to leave me alone. Rufus brought me back to life, inch by inch, and when we returned home to Yorkshire, I swore we'd spend our days in peace. But, as every Englishman knows, peace is never permanent, especially on land that remembers war. Enter Avalon. If you know horses, you know the difference between a wild Mustang and a thoroughbred born for the track. Avalon is the latter, but fate made her a survivor, not a winner's trophy. She came to us in a way I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. A summer storm, a bolt of lightning, and an old stone barn burning like a funeral pyre against the black sky. I remember it perfectly. The sound of thunder, the smell of wet hay and smoke, the frantic shouts of estate staff running through the rain with buckets and blankets, and above it all, the piercing, desperate whinny of a foal who had just lost everything. I ran through the rain with Rufus at my side, his coat slick with mud, both of us blind and stumbling. The barn was nearly lost, but somehow, amidst the chaos, I heard her, Avalon, barely more than a filly, trembling in the wreckage, her mother gone. For a moment, I froze. You don't recover from war, not really, but you learn to act when it matters. I forced myself to move. I reached her, wrapped her in an old army blanket, and whispered nonsense to keep us both from falling apart. I think Rufus understood what she needed more than I did. He lay down beside her in the straw, his big head resting against her skinny flank, steady and silent as stone. That night changed everything. Avalon survived, but she was never the same. Neither was I. The estate, usually a place of tradition and order, suddenly felt more like a battlefield, and not just for me. The truth is, running a manor these days isn't the Downton Abbey fantasy Americans love. It's endless financial pressure, crumbling stonework, and the heavy expectation that you'll preserve something you didn't choose but can never abandon. That burden sat on my shoulders as surely as the rain beat against the manor windows. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit with Rufus at my feet and Avalon in the stable and wonder if we were all just lost creatures in need of rescue. But you didn't come here for a history lesson. You want the hook, the moment everything went from bad to legendary. It started innocently enough, with morning chores and Yorkshire drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones. I was feeding Avalon, who was still shy and twitchy, when Rufus decided he'd had enough of her skittishness. He trotted over, dropped his favorite battered tennis ball at her hooves, and stared her down with those amber eyes that said, "Come on then, life's for living." I watched in disbelief as Avalon, nervous, fragile Avalon, nudged the ball right back at him. Just like that, an unlikely friendship was born. They became inseparable. If you ever visit Ashford Manor, you'll see it yourself. The dog and the filly running side by side across the wild, rain-swept fields, a blur of muddy fur and shining chestnut, chasing each other as if the world had always meant for them to be together. There were days I'd stand under the dripping oaks, still in my dressing gown, and wonder if maybe this was the miracle I'd been waiting for all my life. But peace, as I said, never lasts in Yorkshire. The river had been rising for weeks. First, a trickle over the banks, then a slow, relentless surge, until the fields were sodden and the manor itself stood like a castle in a dark sea. I checked the weather apps, called the staff, double-checked the livestock shelters. I thought we were ready for anything. I was wrong. One morning, I awoke to the sound of shouting. Not angry, but urgent, panicked. I pulled on my boots and ran outside, heart pounding, to see water everywhere, cold and brown and fast. The stables, Avalon's sanctuary, were half flooded. Avalon and Rufus were gone. It was as if the world stood still, just for a heartbeat. That's when the story really begins. The search, the heartbreak, the miracle that followed, and the viral video that made the whole of Britain hold its breath as a dog and a filly braved the worst storm Yorkshire had seen in decades. You think you've seen everything, until you find yourself combing drone footage for a flash of gold and black in a river wild enough to swallow anything in its path. You think you know about friendship, until you see what a Labrador will do for a filly who's lost her way. And you think you understand what it means to be a caretaker, until you realize how desperately you need saving too. So, are you with me? Don't blink, don't turn away, because the next 6 minutes will change the way you see loyalty, courage, and what it really means to come home. This is only the beginning. You never really forget the sound of fire and thunder colliding in the middle of the English night. That summer in Yorkshire, the rain was relentless, day after day, pounding the slate roofs and turning every lane into a slick, muddy river. We were used to wet seasons, but that particular week, the air felt electric, heavy with something waiting to snap. Even the animals sensed it. You could feel the restlessness in the horses, the low growls from Rufus, the crows circling lower than usual over the fields. It happened on a Thursday evening, just after dinner. I was pouring myself a second cup of tea, Rufus at my feet, the BBC murmuring in the background, when the world outside cracked open. A bolt of lightning slammed into the old stone barn, shattering the calm with a sound so loud it rattled the china on the mantel. For a split second, time paused. Then came the alarm, the housekeeper's shouts, the wild ringing of the farm bell, and the unmistakable stench of burning hay and wet wood. I grabbed my jacket, shouting for the stable hands as I tore across the yard. Rufus was already ahead of me, his instincts sharper than any man's. The rain came down in sheets, so cold and thick it almost blinded me. But I could see the orange glow blooming in the darkness, black smoke curling toward the sky like some ancient curse. My boots splashed through standing water, mud sucking at my heels, but all I could think was, not the horses, not the barn. When I reached the door, the heat hit me like a wall. The barn was an inferno, the old timbers hissing and groaning under the weight of the fire. I could hear the panicked whinnying of horses, the crash of hooves on splintering wood. The hands were already at work, hauling open the stalls, leading the terrified animals into the storm. Rufus darted in and out, barking at stragglers, his coat steaming in the heat. Then I heard this, a thin, desperate sound, different from the others. It wasn't a scream of panic, but a high, wavering cry. I forced my way deeper inside, the smoke choking, the world shrinking to a tunnel of heat and noise. That's when I saw her, Avalon, sooty and trembling, standing over her mother's lifeless body. Her eyes met mine, wild and glassy, and for a moment neither of us moved. "Come on, girl," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the roar. I stretched out a hand, trying to ignore the way my heart hammered in my chest. Avalon flinched, but then Rufus appeared at her side. He didn't bark or lunge, just leaned against her, calm and solid as ever. She took a shaky step forward, then another, until she was close enough for me to slip a halter over her head. The three of us stumbled out into the storm, the barn collapsing behind us with a crash that shook the earth. I led Avalon to the paddock, hands shaking, tears mixing with rain on my cheeks. The rest of the horses milled about, spooked but safe, but Avalon would not leave Rufus's side. She pressed her nose to his wet fur, shivering uncontrollably, and he simply sat with her until the fire burned out. Afterwards, there was only silence. The barn was a blackened ruin, the smell of smoke lingering long after the rain had washed away the last embers. I walked Avalon to a makeshift shelter, wrapping her in old wool blankets, whispering encouragement I wasn't sure I believed myself. Rufus lay beside her, eyes half closed, but always watchful, a sentinel in the darkness. For the next few days, I barely slept. Avalon refused to eat, her eyes constantly scanning for her mother, her muscles taut as wire. She'd startle at the smallest sound, sweat breaking out on her neck even in the cool night air. The staff worried she wouldn't make it. Foals don't always survive a trauma like that, not when the world turns violent so young. But Rufus wouldn't let her slip away. Every morning he'd nudge her to her feet, licking her muzzle, sometimes bringing her little offerings, an old glove, a ball, once even a stick he'd fished out of the pond. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Avalon started to respond. The first time she took a carrot from my hand, it felt like a minor miracle. The day she chased Rufus across the paddock, I laughed so hard the rest of the staff thought I'd finally lost my mind. That summer became a study in contrasts: the relentless rain, the mud and ruin of the fire, and the fragile, blooming friendship between a war-scarred dog and an orphaned filly. I started filming them on my phone, short clips of Avalon and Rufus running side by side, sharing breakfast, dozing under the same tree. I posted a few to the estate's social media, mostly for the locals, but it didn't take long for them to spread. Within days, messages poured in from all over England. People wanted to see more, to follow their story, to believe in a little hope carved from tragedy. It wasn't all easy. There were setbacks: Avalon's limp, days when she refused to move, nights when thunder sent her into a panic. But Rufus was always there, steadfast and uncomplaining. I realized then that his loyalty, the same calm that pulled me out of nightmares, was now saving Avalon in ways none of us could explain. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in the dark with a mug of tea and watch the rain blur the world outside the kitchen window. I'd think about the fire, about everything I'd lost and nearly lost again. And every time, without fail, I'd see Rufus and Avalon together, two survivors refusing to be defined by fear. I thought for a moment that maybe things would finally settle. Maybe this strange little family we'd formed could weather the next storm. But in England, storms have a way of circling back, and there were other battles on the horizon, not fire or flood, but the slow, grinding pressure of money, legacy, and the decisions that tear a family apart. I'll tell you about that soon enough. For now, remember this: sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in fire and rain, and sometimes the greatest rescues aren't the ones you plan. They're the ones that change everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and what it means to belong. Life at Ashford Manor after the fire found its own rhythm again, though everything felt changed, as if some invisible line had been crossed that none of us could ever step back over. In the weeks that followed, the countryside itself seemed to conspire to help us heal. Wildflowers sprang up along the scorched edges of the old barn. The grass returned greener than before, and a kind of tentative peace settled across the fields, punctuated by the lowing of cattle and the quiet nickering of horses. Avalon, with her bandaged leg and wary eyes, became the heart of our new little world. Most mornings began in that soft, gray half-light unique to Yorkshire, when the air was thick with dew and the mist hung so low it seemed you could scoop it up in your hands. I'd wake to the sound of Rufus's claws clicking down the hallway, always before dawn, always eager for what came next. We'd slip into our wellies, or at least I would, while Rufus just shot me that "let's get on with it" look, and make our rounds. It was on those mornings, with Avalon waiting quietly at the edge of the paddock, that I realized just how much she'd come to rely on us. She'd perk up the second she spotted Rufus, ears pricking, nostrils flaring, her whole body trembling with the possibility of play or comfort. The first time she let him nuzzle her cheek, not just tolerate, but actually seek out that contact, I felt something unclench in my chest, a knot I didn't even know I'd been carrying. Our routines became rituals. After breakfast, I'd set out a bucket of feed for Avalon, and Rufus would station himself nearby like a loyal footman, keeping watch as she ate. Sometimes Avalon would finish early and nudge him with her nose, almost playful, and he'd trot off to fetch his battered old ball, dropping it near her hooves, tail wagging. By midsummer, they had a kind of morning dance, Rufus darting in zigzags, Avalon chasing him in slow circles, the two of them carving paths through the mist, sunlight breaking over their backs as if blessing the whole unlikely scene. It wasn't just them who found solace in these moments. There were nights when my own mind grew too loud, when the memories from Afghanistan would crawl out from whatever corner I'd shoved them into and wrap icy hands around my throat. On those nights, I'd sit up late with a pot of strong tea, sometimes walking the grounds, sometimes just staring at the fire and trying to breathe through the heaviness. Rufus would always find me, curling at my feet or resting his head in my lap, a silent reminder that I was still here, still needed. And Avalon, even she seemed to sense those moods, pressing herself against the fence, eyes soft, as if she knew that survival meant more than just getting through the night. The estate itself, of course, demanded attention. I had staff to manage: old Tom, who'd been the groundskeeper since before I was born; Emily, the stable manager, who could calm a spooked stallion with a word; a handful of part-timers from the village, all of them as deeply entwined with Ashford as I was. There were repairs to make, new fencing to put up, insurance claims to file after the fire, endless meetings with the family accountant about budgets, grants, and the ever-looming threat of insolvency. See, the truth about English manors is that they're not the bottomless wells of gold everyone thinks. The old money trickles away, eaten up by taxes and repairs, and each generation is left with a little less. I felt it every day, the pressure to honor my ancestors, to keep the estate running, to save the land and the animals that depended on it. There were evenings when I'd stand on the porch with a glass of whiskey and stare out at the rolling hills, the sky streaked with pink and gold, and wonder if it was all slipping away, bit by bit. But then Rufus and Avalon would come thundering across the field, muddy and joyous, and I'd remember why we fight so hard to hold on to these places. It wasn't for the title, or the tradition, or even the history. It was for these living, breathing moments, for the tiny pockets of grace that made all the sacrifice worth it. One afternoon, as summer reached its height, I brewed a pot of strong Yorkshire tea and brought it out to the garden. Emily and Tom joined me, and we watched as Avalon grazed beside Rufus, the dog occasionally glancing up as if checking to be sure we were all still watching. There was laughter, stories traded about past storms and horse shows, a brief argument about whether Yorkshire pudding was best with roast beef or just by itself. It felt almost normal, almost like the world hadn't tilted off its axis just a few weeks before. But even as we enjoyed these small comforts, the larger world pressed in. Letters arrived from the family solicitors, urgent and pointed. A local newspaper wanted to do a story on Avalon's rescue, and I found myself fielding calls from curious strangers who'd seen the clips of Rufus and Avalon online, TikTok, Instagram, even a few viral posts on British Twitter. It was flattering, but it was also a reminder that privacy was slipping away, that our quiet healing had become a kind of public spectacle. And then, almost out of the blue, came the letter from Lady Eleanor Beaumont. We'd known each other for years. She ran a renowned equine therapy center down in the Cotswolds, a place where troubled children and wounded soldiers found hope among the horses.
Her offer was generous, and on paper, it was exactly what the estate needed. A partnership, a promise of funding, maybe even a way to secure Avalon's future and the manor's too. But as I stood in the paddock, watching Rufus and Avalon nose to nose under a sky full of rainbows, I felt the first shiver of unease. There are choices that look good on paper, and then there's the reality of what you're being asked to give up. That evening, with the sun sinking behind the hills and Avalon resting her head on Rufus's back, I knew change was coming, whether we wanted it or not. Sometimes, the hardest part of belonging somewhere or to someone is realizing that the fight to keep it never really ends. And as always, the rain kept falling on Yorkshire, washing away the easy answers, leaving us to navigate the muddy, complicated beauty of our lives together. Change arrives quietly sometimes, like the Yorkshire fog. You barely notice it at first, a soft chill, a shift in the light, until it settles in for good. That summer, just as the estate felt whole again, I found myself standing at the crossroads of the old world and the new, haunted by decisions that couldn't be delayed any longer. It was never just about the animals or the crumbling barns. It was about legacy, duty, and those lines you draw in your heart when you belong to something older than yourself.
Lady Eleanor's letter sat unopened on my desk for nearly a week, the heavy envelope embossed with her elegant script. I'd reread the outside a dozen times, remembering the years gone by, London dinner parties, charity balls, and those long, rambling conversations in smoky drawing rooms about the future of England's rural estates. She was sharp, brilliant, respected by everyone from Parliament to the racing syndicates. When she offered help, it was never charity, it was an opportunity, and you'd be a fool not to listen. Still, I hesitated. Her offer was generous, almost painfully so. She proposed that Avalon join her therapy program down in the Cotswolds, with funding in exchange for rights to Ashford's breeding stock and shared use of the grounds for children's events. On the surface, it made sense. The estate needed the money. Avalon would have a new purpose. The public would see Ashford Manor as part of something larger, nobler, and more secure. But paper doesn't hold memories. Paper doesn't know what it's like to watch a filly learn to trust again, or see a war dog coax her through nightmares. Paper doesn't feel the weight of dawn after a sleepless night, or the quiet joy in the way Avalon nickered for Rufus each morning. I called a staff meeting in the main kitchen, the heart of the manor, all ancient stone, battered tables, and the ever-present scent of tea and wood smoke. Emily, Tom, a few others from the village, even the new accountant from Leeds who kept reminding me about cash flow. I laid out Eleanor's offer, line by line, and watched the faces around me shift from hope to uncertainty to something close to resignation. Emily was the first to speak, her voice low but clear. "It's a fair offer, sir. Might be the only way to keep the lights on another winter. But what about Avalon? And Rufus?" I had no easy answers. "If we do this," I said, "Avalon will have a home and a future. But it won't be here. We'll still have the land, and maybe the means to save the rest. But it's a trade, not a gift." Tom cleared his throat, rough hands twisting his cap. "I've seen too many good horses sent away, sir. Never seen one quite like her, though. That dog won't take to it kindly neither." The accountant, all crisp suit and city nerves, said what I couldn't. "The estate is bleeding money. The insurance payout from the fire won't cover half the repairs. If you want Ashford to last, this is the smart move." I nodded, feeling older than I ever had. "We'll decide in the morning." That night, sleep was impossible. I walked the grounds in the cold drizzle, Rufus at my side, his nose pressed to my palm. Avalon watched us from the shelter, her eyes following every step. I knelt beside her, running my hands through her mane. "What would you choose, girl?" I whispered. "Freedom or belonging? Safety or the wild?" The morning came with leaden skies and a silence that felt like a verdict. I made the call to Eleanor. She was gracious, as always, promising Avalon would be cared for, treasured, loved.
Arrangements were made swiftly, too swiftly. The next afternoon, a horse van arrived, gleaming and out of place among the muddy lanes and stone walls of Ashford. Emily led Avalon out, her gait strong now, her coat shining. Rufus paced restlessly, whining low in his throat, refusing to leave her side. I handed over Avalon's halter, my fingers numb. Eleanor herself had come, dressed for the city, but wearing wellies like the rest of us. She hugged me, brief and businesslike. "You've done a good thing, William. For her, for everyone." Maybe, but it didn't feel like a victory. I watched Avalon load into the van, Rufus barking and tugging at his leash, desperate. As the doors shut, Avalon turned, and in that moment, the connection between her and Rufus, forged in fire and loss, felt stretched to breaking. The days after were hollow. The staff worked in quiet, repairing what we could, but the manor felt emptier, stripped of some essential warmth. Rufus was inconsolable. He lay in the mud where Avalon had stood, whining, refusing his food, his eyes searching the horizon. I tried everything, treats, long walks, even letting him sleep in my own bed. Nothing worked. He wanted her, and nothing else. I wrote to Eleanor, begging for updates. She replied promptly. Avalon had arrived safely, was adjusting slowly, but she missed home. The Cotswolds were beautiful, but they weren't Yorkshire. Avalon became rebellious, refusing to join group therapy, bolting fences, charging at the unfamiliar horses. Even among children who loved her, she seemed lost.
The manor became a place of ghosts. Tea by the fire held no comfort, just memories of Avalon's soft knickers and Rufus's steady breathing at my feet. The villagers noticed the difference too. Old Tom took to standing by the paddock, hat in hand, staring at nothing. Emily spent hours in the stable, cleaning stalls that didn't need cleaning, hands shaking as she worked. I tried to tell myself it was the right choice, for the estate, for the legacy, for everyone who depended on Ashford. But every night, sitting alone in the kitchen with only the rain for company, I wondered who really benefited from all these sacrifices. Was the price of survival always so steep? Or was this just another lesson the old world taught those foolish enough to try and preserve it? And then, when I thought the worst had passed, when resignation finally began to settle in, nature reminded us that it always has the last word. The river, swollen by weeks of unrelenting rain, began to creep beyond its banks. The ground, already sodden, could take no more. Flood warnings flashed on my phone, the kind you hope you'll never need. I looked at Rufus, then the empty stall where Avalon had slept, and felt a new fear settle in my bones. Because just as one wound began to close, another was about to be ripped wide open. And some losses, I realized, can't be bargained away. Not for money, not for legacy, not for anything. It's strange how quickly disaster can erase all sense of normalcy, even in a place as rooted in tradition as Ashford Manor. One day you're fretting over bills, haunted by choices you can't take back, and the next you're watching the river, something so familiar, so woven into your family's story, transform into a wild, merciless thing. When the first warnings arrived, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than the usual Yorkshire bluster, the kind of alarmist message that popped up every wet season. But deep down, I knew this time was different. The rain hadn't stopped in weeks. The ground was saturated, the brooks were churning, and even the old-timers in the village shook their heads, muttering about floods they hadn't seen in 50 years. That morning, I woke to an eerie silence, the kind that always comes before chaos. Even Rufus seemed unsettled, pacing the kitchen, whining softly, his nose pressed to the door. I pulled on my boots, bracing myself as I stepped outside. The air was heavy and thick, the sky a smothered, metallic gray. Water pooled everywhere.
The lower fields were already a patchwork of shallow lakes, and the current in the river had grown swift and brown, tearing at the banks as if trying to claw its way into the heart of the estate. We'd prepared as best we could. Emily and Tom had spent days moving livestock to higher ground, reinforcing the paddocks, stacking sandbags around the main house and stables. Still, as I made my way toward the barns, I knew it wouldn't be enough. The land itself seemed to groan with every gust of wind, the trees bending and creaking as if sharing in our dread. Rufus stuck by my side, his coat soaked through in minutes, but he wouldn't go back inside, even when I tried to coax him. He knew, somehow, that everything was at stake. The staff gathered in the yard, their faces drawn, eyes darting toward the swelling river. We moved quickly, double-checking the gates and fences, counting the horses, securing what little we could. By midday, the water was rising faster than any of us could believe. The old stone wall by the east meadow collapsed with a sickening crack, and a wave of muddy water surged across the pasture. The sheep scattered, bleating in terror. Tom and I scrambled through knee-deep water to round them up, shouting orders no one could hear over the rush and roar. Emily ran to fetch feed, her boots sucked off by the mud more than once, but she never stopped moving. In the chaos, I realized Rufus was missing. For one heart-stopping moment, I spun in circles, scanning the yard, the fields, the distant tree line. Then I spotted him, already halfway down the flooded lane, barking at something I couldn't see. Panic surged through me. I waded after him, slipping, cursing, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of the water. I caught up with Rufus near the far gate, just as the last fence post disappeared under the torrent. He was barking at a patch of brambles, his tail high, body tense. For a split second, I thought maybe he'd found a stray lamb or a lost fox. But as I drew closer, I saw what he was really after. Avalon's blanket. The blue wool was tangled in the thorns, already half submerged and swirling in the current. My stomach dropped. I knew in that instant Rufus believed Avalon might be out there, somewhere, caught in the storm.
The thought that she might try to return to find Rufus and her home hit me like a blow. My mind raced. Was it possible? She'd always been clever, always stubborn, and she'd never truly settled at Lady Eleanor's place. Had she escaped? Was she out there now, struggling against flood and fear, looking for something familiar in this drowned world? I made my way back to the main yard, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. I told the staff what I'd found. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but Tom just shook his head grimly. "If she's out there, sir, we've got to find her. We owe her that much." We sprang into action, setting up a search as best we could in the conditions. I called Eleanor. She confirmed what I'd suspected, her voice tight with worry. Avalon had bolted 2 nights ago, breaking through a weak section of the paddock. She'd been spotted on a security camera, heading north, straight into the storm. Eleanor had alerted local authorities and posted on every social media account she could think of, but there'd been no sign of Avalon since. That was when the story took a twist no one could have predicted. Emily rushed outside, phone in hand, waving it wildly. "Sir, look at this!" She showed me a grainy video just posted on TikTok. It was Avalon, muddy, wild-eyed, galloping along the edge of a flooded road. And there, a few frames later, was Rufus, trailing just behind her, barking, both of them dodging cars and debris as the rain poured down in sheets. My heart leapt into my throat. The video was already spreading fast, shared by local teens and animal lovers all over England. Within hours, the hashtag #AshfordRescue was trending. Strangers posted sightings, offered boats, even volunteers with drones reached out to help search the floodplain. I felt the weight of the world, knowing that what began as a quiet heartbreak had become a national story. Ashford Manor was no longer just fighting to survive. It was at the center of something much bigger, a test of hope, endurance, and what it meant to never give up, no matter the odds. As the light faded and the water kept rising, I stood at the edge of the field, Rufus leaning against my leg, the blue blanket clutched tight in my fist. I whispered into the rain, not caring if anyone heard. "Come home, Avalon. We're waiting." The flood had changed everything. Avalon was out there. Rufus would risk anything to find her. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this was just the beginning of a journey none of us would ever forget. There are moments in life when the whole world seems to narrow down to a single purpose, a point of focus so sharp you forget about everything else, even the ache in your bones or the cold rain soaking through every layer of your clothes. That's what the next 48 hours felt like. Avalon was out there, somewhere in the storm, and Rufus and I were going to find her, no matter what it took. The manor, the family legacy, even the flooded fields, none of it mattered compared to the need to bring her home. The village mobilized like I'd never seen. The viral TikTok clip of Avalon and Rufus had set off a tidal wave of attention across England. Strangers arrived in muddy boots and rain gear, carrying sandwiches, binoculars, and drones. Volunteers from as far as Leeds and York packed into the old community hall, plotting routes on paper maps, arguing about possible sightings and the best places to look. Teenagers with iPhones combed the hedgerows, calling out Avalon's name, their voices echoing in the rain. Someone from the BBC called, asking if they could film a segment for the evening news. I barely had the energy to answer. Every few hours, another shaky video or blurry photo surfaced on social media. Avalon was spotted crossing a bridge half swallowed by water. Rufus was caught on someone's Ring camera, trotting determinedly after her along a country lane. Each new sighting set off another burst of hope and activity. Emily set up a command post in the tack room, tracking everything on her laptop, her face pale and intent. Tom was out with a group of volunteers, wading through floodwater with nothing but a flashlight and his stubborn Yorkshire grit. I refused to sit and wait. I joined the search, hiking through fields that had become marshes, calling Avalon's name until my voice cracked. Rufus never left my side, except when he picked up a scent and darted ahead, nose to the ground, tail slicing through the wet grass like a rudder. He seemed tireless, driven by some inner compass that pointed straight to Avalon, no matter how hopeless it seemed.
One of the volunteers brought a drone, a sleek black thing that looked oddly futuristic against the battered stone walls of Ashford Manor. We sent it up over the fields, watching the muddy video feed on a tablet, scanning for any movement. The technology was impressive, but the land was vast, and the water had transformed everything. Trees stood half submerged, fences vanished beneath the brown torrent, and everywhere the sky pressed down in an endless, sodden gray. By the second night, exhaustion set in. I sat on the porch with Rufus, rubbing his ears, my hands shaking from cold and fatigue. Emily handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing mine, and for a moment we just stared at each other, both too drained to speak. "What if we're too late?" she whispered finally. The words hit like a punch to the gut. "We're not," I replied, forcing myself to believe it. "Rufus hasn't given up, neither will I." That night, just before dawn, a message arrived. A cyclist had seen a horse and a black dog near the old railway bridge miles east of the manor. I jolted awake, adrenaline flooding my veins. We grabbed torches, called out to Tom and the others, and set off, the village rescue team trailing behind us in battered Land Rovers. The rain had finally let up, but fog clung to the ground, making every shape uncertain. Rufus ran ahead, barking into the mist. We reached the bridge and spread out, searching the banks, calling Avalon's name. And then, out of nowhere, a distant whinny split the quiet. Rufus froze, ears up, his whole body trembling. He darted toward the sound, and I followed, my heart hammering as I slipped down the muddy embankment. There she was, Avalon, her chestnut coat slick with rain, standing knee-deep in a flooded ditch.
She was trembling, head held high, eyes wide with fear, but alive, so gloriously alive. Rufus bounded to her side, barking and licking her face, circling her in wild relief. Avalon nickered softly, lowering her head to touch his, her whole body relaxing at the sound of his voice. I slid into the ditch, ignoring the cold water that seeped into my boots. "Easy, girl," I murmured, reaching out with shaking hands. She shied away at first, but Rufus pressed close, and she let me run my hands along her neck, feeling for injuries, whispering nonsense as if words alone could make her whole again. With Tom and the others' help, we coaxed Avalon out of the ditch and back onto solid ground. Her legs were scratched and bruised, her sides heaving with exhaustion, but she walked, step by painful step, Rufus glued to her side. Someone snapped a photo, Avalon and Rufus silhouetted against the pale morning light, the manor rising in the distance like something out of a storybook. The image spread online before we even made it home. But we weren't out of danger. The floodwaters still blocked most of the roads, and the only way back was a roundabout path over fields and stone fences. Avalon limped, her strength fading, but she refused to stop. Rufus kept pace, bumping her gently, urging her on. Every few minutes I looked back, terrified she might collapse or vanish into the mist once more. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the edge of Ashford Manor. The staff rushed out, tears streaming down their faces. Emily wrapped her arms around me, then ran to Avalon, checking her injuries with the practiced hands of someone who'd saved more lives than I could count. Tom hugged Rufus, burying his face in the dog's wet fur. Someone played the BBC News clip on a phone. The story had gone national, a tale of hope and survival in a year that desperately needed both. I saw myself on screen, mud-streaked and wild-eyed, holding Avalon's lead rope with Rufus at my side. The story of Ashford Manor wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd watched, waited, and willed these two friends home. As night fell, I sat in the stable with Avalon and Rufus, exhaustion finally catching up to me. I rested my head against Avalon's side, Rufus curled up at my feet, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself cry. Not from fear or grief, but from a joy so fierce it felt like forgiveness. And somewhere outside, beyond the floodwaters and the ruined fields, the world kept turning. We had made it through the storm, together. But even as I drifted to sleep, I knew the story wasn't finished. Every rescue, every reunion, brings its own new set of challenges. But for now, we were home. For now, we were whole. You'd think that after all we'd survived, the fire, the flood, the desperate search, the world might finally give us a break. For a few hours, maybe it did. Avalon and Rufus lay curled together in the straw, too tired to move, their breathing slow and even, the kind of sleep you only find after your body's been pushed beyond its limits. Emily and Tom kept a quiet vigil, tending to Avalon's cuts, gently checking her for bruises or signs of fever, while I tried to answer the flood of calls and messages from journalists, neighbors, and total strangers moved by our story. But Yorkshire weather has a mind of its own, and the land doesn't care how much you've already lost. That evening, a heavy fog rolled in, thick and blinding, hugging the ground so tightly you couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. The air crackled with leftover tension, branches snapping, sheep bleating nervously in distant fields, the manor itself groaning with every gust of wind. The ground was still waterlogged, the roads more rivers than roads. For all our hope, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. I was right. Just past midnight, the emergency radio we'd been using crackled to life. There'd been a landslide up the road near the old mill, cutting off half the village and blocking the only reliable way in and out of the manor. Worse, the rain had started up again, a slow, insistent drizzle that promised to turn the already treacherous backroads into pure mud. I should have felt fear, but instead I felt a strange, cold clarity. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for the world to fix itself. I went to check on Avalon and Rufus one last time before making the rounds. Avalon struggled to her feet as I approached, head low but ears pricked, watching my every move. Rufus wagged his tail, but there was worry in his eyes.
He knew, in that way animals always do, that the danger wasn't over. I tried to reassure them, murmuring nonsense and scratching behind Rufus's ears. "We've made it this far," I whispered, "but we're not safe yet." I slipped out of the stable, boots sinking into the muck, flashlight beam bouncing off the fog. I was halfway to the main house when a blinding set of headlights came barreling down the drive, splattering mud everywhere. A battered pickup screeched to a halt. It was a local farmer, out of breath, face pale. "There's been an accident on the highway," he shouted. "Horse trailer overturned. Police are calling for help. They know you've got experience, and you've got the only working vet kit left in the area." For a moment, I just stood there, mind racing. I glanced back at the stable. Avalon and Rufus needed me, but so did whoever was trapped out on that dark, washed-out stretch of road. Duty wins every time. I grabbed my emergency kit and ran for the pickup, shouting for Tom to stay with the animals and Emily to keep the manor on lockdown. The drive was harrowing. The fog was so thick you could barely see the end of the hood, and every dip in the road threatened to tip us sideways. Water pooled in the low spots, turning ditches into hidden traps. We passed flashing blue lights and flares marking the edge of the landslide. When we finally reached the accident, I saw a mangled trailer on its side, 2 horses tangled in their harnesses, hooves thrashing in panic. Police officers waved us down. "We need someone who can calm them, fast." Without thinking, I shoved the kit into the farmer's hands and crawled inside the wreckage. My heart hammered in my chest, every sense sharpened. I spoke softly, just like I did with Avalon, words, tone, steady hands. I managed to slip a halter over the first horse, guiding her out inch by inch, ignoring the sting of glass and twisted metal. The second horse was in worse shape, blood streaking its flank, eyes wide and wild. I wrapped a bandage as best I could, then called for a sedative from my kit. It was a blur of activity, police, volunteers, even a paramedic team from the village. In that chaos, time bent and twisted. Eventually, both horses were safe, loaded onto another trailer. I realized, hands shaking, that I was covered in mud and blood, rain dripping off the brim of my cap. The officers clapped me on the back, murmuring thanks. Someone handed me a flask of whiskey, and I took a grateful swig, the burn chasing away the worst of my fear. The drive back was even more dangerous. By now, word had spread on social media, live streams from the scene, updates on the rescue, hashtags piling up by the minute. I was a mess, but all I could think of was getting home to Avalon and Rufus. When I finally pulled up to the manor, dawn was just breaking, a smear of gold and gray on the horizon. I stumbled inside the stable, breathless and shaking. Avalon lifted her head and whinnied softly, as if she'd been waiting for me all night. Rufus was already there, pressed close to her side, his eyes never leaving the door.
I collapsed in the straw, utterly spent, and let them crowd in around me. Emily arrived with a blanket and a cup of tea, kneeling beside us. "You did good," she said quietly. "You brought them home, all of them." But just as I thought we might have a moment of peace, my phone buzzed. Lady Eleanor was calling. She'd seen the news, the live streams, the hashtags. She was worried for Avalon, worried for me, and, though she didn't say it outright, worried about the future of Ashford Manor itself. She was sending a helicopter with supplies, she insisted, and if we needed to evacuate, she wanted Avalon and Rufus on that chopper. I looked at my 2 old friends, still pressed close together, and felt a new surge of protectiveness. I wasn't about to let anyone, or anything, tear us apart again, not after everything we'd fought for. And so, as the sun rose over the battered, beautiful hills of Yorkshire, I steeled myself for the next battle. I didn't know what the day would bring, mudslides, more rain, more impossible choices, but I knew this: whatever came, we'd face it together. You'd think by now I'd have learned to expect the unexpected. But as the sun pushed through gray Yorkshire clouds that morning, lighting up the battered fields and swollen river, I felt hope battling with a bone-deep exhaustion I couldn't shake. The manor was still an island in a sea of mud.
the roads blocked, and the air thick with the worry that maybe, just maybe, we'd finally hit the end of our luck. Helicopter rotors cut through the dawn, sending ripples across the flooded pasture. Lady Eleanor's promise hadn't been empty. Her team arrived with crates of feed, medicine, and a vet I vaguely remembered from London charity events. It should have felt like salvation, but to me, it sounded like the world closing in. I wasn't ready to let Avalon out of my sight, not after fighting so hard to bring her home. The thought of her being lifted away again, even for her own good, set my teeth on edge. Eleanor herself arrived an hour later, all business and brisk energy. She hugged me, scanned the devastation, and zeroed in on Avalon, who stood trembling behind Rufus. "William, she needs care, real care," Eleanor said. "The manor's a disaster. You know she can't recover here." "I know," I admitted, my voice low. "But she's only just found her way home. The words caught in my throat. Eleanor's eyes softened. "Let's see what the vet says." The exam was tense, Avalon flinching at every strange hand, Rufus growling at anyone who came too close. The vet nodded seriously, declared Avalon exhausted but not beyond saving, and left me with a list of instructions that sounded more like a wish than a plan. Rest, shelter, warmth, no more stress. It felt impossible in a house that might flood again any minute. Outside, the air buzzed with activity. News crews set up along the edge of the manor drive, the drone of the BBC's helicopter blending with the distant bleating of sheep. Volunteers came and went, faces lit with relief as they glimpsed Avalon, mud-streaked and regal, peering out from her stall. Someone from a local animal charity brought flowers and a camera crew, begging for a photo of Avalon and Rufus together. It was in that chaos, with so many eyes watching, that the next miracle happened. As the crowd gathered, a sudden commotion broke out near the far pasture. Shouts, splashes, then the sight of a boy, barely older than 12, struggling to pull a stranded lamb from the rising water. I shouted for help and ran toward them, boots sinking in mud, heart racing. Rufus was there before me, barking encouragement, circling the pair, and then Avalon, wounded, limping, pushed out of her stall and into the yard. She didn't hesitate. She moved with a stubborn grace, following Rufus's barks straight into the muck. The cameras caught every moment. The soaked child, the shivering lamb, the battered filly, and the old dog side by side in the morning light. The images went everywhere. On TikTok, the hashtag Ashford Rescue exploded. On BBC News, they called it the spirit of Yorkshire. The Prime Minister himself tweeted about courage and compassion at Ashford Manor. For a moment, all the loss and pain was eclipsed of something bigger, hope, visible and real. When the crowd cleared and calm returned, I found myself surrounded by neighbors and strangers alike, all offering congratulations, supplies, and, most importantly, support. Donations poured in, enough to cover repairs and then some. A local business offered to sponsor the manor's rescue program. Someone started a GoFundMe, and within hours it had reached its target. But what mattered most was that Avalon and Rufus, against every odd, had come home not just to us, but to an entire country watching, rooting for them. That evening, as the last light faded, the three of us sat in the stable, Avalon lying down at last, Rufus resting his head on her flank, and me, too wrung out to speak, but more grateful than I'd ever been. Emily slipped in with mugs of tea, her eyes red from crying. "You did it, sir. They did it. I think maybe we all did, together." I nodded, unable to keep the tears from stinging my eyes. Outside, the fields were still a mess, and the manor would take months to mend, but something had shifted. The air was lighter, the fear replaced by a quiet certainty that for now at least we'd weathered the storm. Lady Eleanor approached before she left, her voice soft as she looked at Avalon. "She belongs here, William. If you ever need help, you know where to find me." "I do," I said, "but she's home." The night was gentle for the first time in weeks.
I sat with Rufus and Avalon, listening to the wind in the eaves, the soft sounds of life returning to normal. I watched them sleep, their sides rising and falling in unison, and thought about how much we'd risked for this, how much we'd gained. Later, as the stars appeared above the battered fields, I realized that the story wasn't just about rescue. It was about resilience, about the stubborn refusal to let go of what matters most, no matter how high the waters rise. And for the first time since the fire, I slept deeply, dreaming not of loss, but of hope and all the wild, beautiful tomorrows waiting for us at Ashford Manor. It's a strange thing, waking up to silence after weeks of chaos. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no shriek of wind, no pounding rain against the windows, no emergency calls or helicopters overhead. Just the quiet hum of morning in Yorkshire, the distant bleat of sheep, the soft nickering of horses, and somewhere out in the fields, Rufus's bark rolling across the green hills like a promise that things might, finally be all right. I sat up in bed, surprised at the lightness in my chest. The manor was still battered, the pastures scarred and pitted, the old stone walls marked by muddy streaks and water lines. But somehow the place felt alive again, renewed by the very struggle that almost broke it. It wasn't just me who felt it. Emily moved through the house humming under her breath, Tom lingered longer by the paddocks, neighbors stopped by with smiles instead of worry in their eyes. Even the sky seemed changed, the usual Yorkshire gray now cut by streaks of gentle blue. I found Rufus and Avalon together in the far pasture, side by side in the tall grass, Avalon's coat still patchy from her ordeal but gleaming in the morning sun. Rufus barked when he saw me, then trotted over, tongue lolling, that familiar, loyal joy back in every movement. Avalon lifted her head, watching me with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed older now, wiser, somehow both vulnerable and strong. I sat down in the grass, Rufus leaning against my leg, Avalon nuzzling my shoulder, and for a long moment I just breathed. The world felt bigger, more forgiving, like I was part of something I couldn't quite explain. It struck me then what this journey had truly been. Not just a fight to save an estate or an animal, but a lesson about what holds us together when the storms come. People started arriving at Ashford Manor in a slow, steady trickle. Friends, neighbors, even strangers from other towns who'd followed our story online. They wanted to see Avalon and Rufus, to touch the filly who'd braved the floods, to thank the old dog whose courage had gone viral. Children pressed their faces against the fence, wide-eyed and hopeful. Reporters showed up with notebooks, cameras, and big, eager questions. The BBC wanted a follow-up segment. A university psychology department asked to study the therapeutic bond between dog and horse. For a while, it all felt surreal, as if I were standing outside my own life, watching it unfold on someone else's screen. But in the quiet moments, over tea with Emily, or walking the muddy fields with Tom, or just sitting with Rufus and Avalon in the dusk, the meaning of it all started to settle in. I thought of my own journey, coming home from war, carrying wounds no one could see, believing I was saving this land when, in truth, it was saving me. I remembered the darkest nights, when all I had was Rufus's steady breathing and the knowledge that somehow we'd make it through. I saw now that Avalon, in her own wild, wounded way, had become a part of that healing. She'd forced me to keep going when quitting would have been easier. She'd reminded me, every time she let Rufus nudge her back to her feet, that sometimes survival is a matter of stubbornness, a refusal to give in, even when the odds are impossible. And for the first time since the fire, I slept deeply, dreaming not of loss, but of hope and all the wild, beautiful tomorrows waiting for us at Ashford Manor.
One afternoon, I was interviewed for a national radio program. The host asked what I thought people could learn from Avalon and Rufus. The question caught me off guard. I stumbled at first, but then the words came. I think what we've all seen here is that real friendship isn't grand gestures or easy answers. It's being present when things fall apart. It's not letting go, no matter how dark it gets. Avalon and Rufus, they didn't save each other because they were told to or because it was their job. They just did. Quiet, steady, loyal.
That's something I think we could all use a little more of these days. The story struck a chord. Emails and letters poured in. Veterans who saw themselves in my struggles. Parents who watched their children light up seeing Avalon run. City folk who admitted they'd forgotten what community felt like. A school in Manchester started a project on resilience, using Avalon's story to teach kids about never giving up. Even the village pub hung a painting of Rufus and Avalon by the fire, a symbol of what it means to weather life's storms together. At home, things changed too. The manor began hosting weekend programs for local families, kids learning to care for animals, veterans finding quiet work in the fields, neighbors sharing meals and laughter in the old kitchen. Avalon became a star, patient and gentle with children who approached her slowly, guided by Rufus's calm presence. There were setbacks, of course. Flashbacks hit me at odd times. Avalon spooked at thunder. Rufus started limping on rainy days, his years catching up at last. But each of us leaned on the others, holding tight through the rough patches, learning that healing isn't a finish line, but a way of life. Looking back, I realized that saving the manor had never been about money or history or pride. It was about refusing to let fear dictate the story, about finding meaning in the struggle, comfort in companionship, and a sense of purpose in showing up for each other day after day. Sometimes in the evenings, I'd walk the land with Rufus at my side and Avalon trailing behind, the sky washed in the colors of a Yorkshire sunset. The fields were still scarred, the fences still needed mending, and the future still uncertain. But I no longer felt alone. Whatever storms lay ahead, I knew we'd weather them as we always had, together, quietly steadfast, never letting go. And that, I realized, was the lesson I needed most. Not that we are saved by grand rescues, but by the small acts of presence and kindness that add up day after day to a life worth living. Some stories end with a tidy bow, a lesson learned, a villain vanquished, a clear horizon after the storm. But real life, especially here at Ashford Manor, rarely offers such clean endings. Instead, it gives you new beginnings, new questions, and a deeper sense of what truly matters. In the weeks and months after the flood, as the fields dried and the repair crews came and went, I found myself thinking less about survival and more about legacy. Not the grand kind measured in portraits and bank accounts, but the quiet kind that lingers in a look, a touch, or a promise kept. Rufus and Avalon became more than just local legends. They were symbols now, of resilience, of community, of that rare and stubborn love that weathers storms and outlasts fear. Every weekend, families would gather on the lawn, children racing through the grass with Rufus close behind, Avalon grazing peacefully nearby. Veterans and volunteers tended the gardens, mended fences, and shared stories in the kitchen over mugs of strong Yorkshire tea. The manor, once a burden, began to feel like a home again, not just for me, but for anyone who needed a place to belong. The restoration work was long and exhausting. I spent whole days hauling debris, painting walls, or digging new drainage ditches with Tom and the other hands. My body ached in ways that reminded me of younger, harder years, but every bruise and blister felt earned. Emily coordinated everything with her usual calm, turning chaos into order, and making sure that, whatever else happened, Avalon and Rufus came first. I'd catch moments sometimes that stopped me in my tracks, a shy child brushing Avalon's coat, a retired soldier teaching a boy how to mend a gate, the laughter of strangers becoming friends over slices of warm cake in the kitchen. These were the treasures I'd almost missed while chasing after the demands of heritage and duty. I realized then that legacy wasn't about what you left behind, but what you created in the lives of others. Kindness, hope, and the courage to keep going. Lady Eleanor kept her word, checking in every few weeks, always offering help, but never pressing. We found our own balance, a partnership based not on contracts or obligations, but mutual respect. Sometimes she'd visit, walking the fields with me at dusk, discussing the changing world of English country life.
You know, William, she told me once, places like Ashford are rare now, but what you're building here, it's more valuable than any estate. It's a community, a refuge. Her words stayed with me. I thought about the manor's long history, the wars, the fires, the endless seasons of growth and loss, and realized that every generation had faced its own version of the flood. My ancestors might not have battled viral hashtags or crumbling internet infrastructure, but they'd fought just as hard to keep this place alive, each in their own way. And now it was my turn to decide what Ashford would mean for the future. Avalon thrived in the months that followed, gaining back her strength and spirit. She led the herd now, gentle but fierce, always looking after the younger foals and guiding them through their first timid steps into the world. Rufus grew older, his muzzle whitening, but his energy remained. He seemed content to spend his days napping in the sun, only getting up when a child needed a friend or Avalon wanted a companion for an afternoon stroll. Their bond became a kind of silent wisdom, a lesson that needed no words. We started offering new programs, animal therapy sessions for veterans, workshops for local schools, even quiet retreats for anyone in need of healing or rest. Ashford Manor slowly turned into something bigger than I'd imagined, its purpose growing from the very struggle that had once threatened to end it. The story of Rufus and Avalon became a kind of myth, a tale parents told their children as they drifted off to sleep, proof that courage and kindness could change not just a farm, but a whole community. On the anniversary of the flood, we held a gathering in the main yard, a celebration not just of survival, but of everything we'd gained. There was music and laughter, homemade bread and local ale, and, as dusk settled, a long moment of silence for what we'd lost. I stood in front of neighbors and friends, Avalon and Rufus at my side, and tried to put into words what the year had meant. "We're still standing," I said, voice rough with emotion, "not because we had all the answers, or because things got easier. We're standing because we refused to let go of each other, because we showed up, day after day, even when it hurt. That's the real legacy of Ashford Manor, not the land, not the house, but the people and the animals who call it home." As the applause faded, I looked at Avalon, at Rufus, at the faces around me, some familiar, some new, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The storms would come again. The world would change in ways I couldn't predict or control. But for the first time, I didn't fear the future. I trusted in the bonds we'd built, the lessons learned in hardship, and the quiet courage that had brought us through the darkest nights. Later, as the celebration wound down and the stars filled the sky, I walked the grounds with Rufus at my side and Avalon trailing just behind. The fields were whole again, the fences repaired, the manor's windows glowing warm in the darkness. I listened to the soft sounds of laughter and music drifting from the house, and knew that, whatever else came, we would endure. If you take anything from our story, let it be this: you don't need to be extraordinary to make a difference. Show up, be loyal, hold fast to hope, even when the water rises. The rest, love, healing, belonging, will follow in its own time. So, if you ever find yourself lost, battered by life's floods, remember Ashford Manor and the old dog and filly who proved that, together, we can weather anything. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to share your own stories. That's how we keep hope alive.